Imagine being torn from your home, your family, and thrown into one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. Now, imagine surviving that hell, but the world believing you were dead. This is the true story of Wilhelm Adler, a young soldier declared dead during World War II, who years later returned, alone, wounded and forgotten by all, a life stolen by the chaos of war, a soul fighting to be remembered. If you've ever felt invisible, abandoned or lost in silence, this story will speak directly to your heart. It's about pain, loss and starting over, but it's also about strength, hope and the unbreakable will to return home. Get ready to discover the truth behind a living legend and realize that sometimes those who suffer the most are the ones the world has already forgotten. Wilhelm Adler was born in a small village in the Austrian mountains, surrounded by tall pine trees, snowy winters, and a silence broken only by church bells or barking shepherd dogs. He was the middle child of 5 siblings, son of a carpenter and a seamstress. From a young age, Wilhelm was curious, fascinated by stories, and deeply attached to his grandfather, a World War I veteran whose eyes carried a permanent sadness. "War takes everything, my boy. Everything," he would say. Wilhelm listened like someone hearing a distant tale, never imagining that his own path would lead to something even darker. As a teenager, Wilhelm was known for being kind, skilled with wood, and always ready to help the elderly neighbors. His dream was simple, to open a small furniture workshop and live a quiet life with his family. But that dream began to fall apart when Germany annexed Austria in 1938. The presence of Nazi soldiers became constant, and the tension in the air grew like a silent storm. Little by little, the village lost its peace. Young men started disappearing. When called to serve the Reich, Wilhelm tried to escape that fate. But in 1942, at the age of 21, the dreaded letter arrived. He had been drafted, not by choice, but by force. Wilhelm's peaceful life was turned upside down. And there began a journey no one could have imagined. It was a cloudy morning in March 1942 when the postman appeared at the Adler family door, his eyes downcast and steps slow. In his hands, he held a brown envelope with the official seal of the Third Reich. Wilhelm's mother opened the door. The moment she saw the paper, she knew. Her hands trembled, her eyes filled with tears before she even read a word. Wilhelm, then 21, stepped forward and took the document. One quick glance was enough to understand. He had been summoned to the German army. There was no option. Refusal meant prison. Resistance was a death sentence. The war, which had once seemed like a distant storm, now knocked on their door and swept away any chance of continuing a normal life. The village fell into silence that afternoon. Neighbors whispered quietly, as if attending a funeral. Wilhelm didn't cry, but his father, a hard man, known for never showing emotion, fell to his knees the moment Wilhelm walked into the room to pack the few belongings he could take. His mother prepared a slice of bread with butter and tucked it into his bag, along with a family photo wrapped in a handkerchief. At the station, when the military train arrived, soldiers shouted orders in German and pushed the young men like cattle. Wilhelm hugged his younger brothers tightly. His older sister leaned in and whispered in his ear, "Come back, no matter." And Gauss to come back. And then with no choice, he stepped into the train car. The metal doors slammed shut. The locomotive began to move, and Wilhelm saw, for the last time, the faces of those he loved. He didn't know it yet, but that farewell would leave a scar on his soul forever. The train that took Wilhelm Adler from his village to Eastern Europe felt endless. Days and nights passed by the window without him knowing exactly where he was. The cold crept in through the cracks of the wagon like a ghost, and the soldiers, many still teenagers, trembled with fear and uncertainty. When they finally Arrived, Wilhelm was thrown into a military training camp deep on the Eastern Front. It was a desolate area, surrounded by snow, mud, and old wooden barracks. There was no warmth, no mercy. The air reeked of sweat, oil, and gunpowder, a constant reminder that war wasn't a distant idea. It was real, and it was beginning at that very moment. The days were long and brutal. Before the sun even rose, the German instructors were already shouting commands. Wilhelm and the other recruits ran for miles carrying heavy rifles, crawled through frozen mud, and trained in hand-to-hand combat with sharp bayonets. There was no room for mistakes. Any hesitation was punished with beatings, extra duties, or days without food. Meals, when they came, were meager, a chunk of stale bread and a bowl of watery soup. Wilhelm, who had never held a weapon before, had to learn to shoot, disassemble and reassemble rifles in seconds, even while blindfolded. He slept on wooden bunks, curled up, with his damp uniform clinging to his skin. At night, he heard the muffled sobs of his fellow soldiers crying into their pillows so they wouldn't be heard. Slowly, fear gave way to numbness. Wilhelm hardened. He learned to silence pain, to turn terror into focus. He didn't want to kill anyone. He just wanted to survive. And on the Eastern Front, only those who became part of the war machine lived another day. The innocence of his youth was buried there, in that filthy snow, under the weight of his helmet and the silence. The day Wilhelm Adler was sent on his first combat mission was etched into his memory like a living scar. The destination? Stalingrad, a Russian city buried under snow, smoke, and despair. As soon as he stepped off the military truck, the smell of gunpowder and burned flesh filled his nostrils. Gunfire echoed like endless thunder, and the sky was so choked with smoke it hid even the sunlight. Wilhelm held his rifle with trembling hands, his fingers nearly frozen. Around him, soldiers screamed orders over the deafening roar of bombs. With every step, he saw bodies sprawled across the ground, some still with their eyes open. This was no longer training. This was survival. He ran, hid among the ruins, fired at shadows, and by the end of the day, with bloody feet and a racing heart, he finally understood. War was the real hell. It was at the height of the Battle of Stalingrad that everything changed. Wilhelm Adler and his platoon were ordered to advance through the ruins of a shattered neighborhood. The snow was stained red, the icy air thick with the stench of death and smoke. They ran, crouched low, dodging bullets from every direction, when suddenly the sky was torn apart by a deafening blast. The explosion was so powerful it hurled Wilhelm through the air like a rag doll. When he opened his eyes, everything around him was dust, blood, and muffled screams. His ears were ringing and his vision was blurred. He tried to stand, but a sharp pain shot through his leg. Around him, the lifeless bodies of his comrades lay scattered. Communication had been cut. No one knew where he was. Covered in mud and debris, Wilhelm lay unconscious for hours. At that moment, his disappearance began. To the army, he was dead, but the story was far from over. Weeks after the devastating explosion in Stalingrad, the silence surrounding Wilhelm Adler's whereabouts spoke volumes. The officers organized a quick search through the rubble, but the bodies were unrecognizable, buried under concrete, snow, and blood. Among the remains, no one responded to Wilhelm's name. There were no documents, no surviving witnesses to confirm what had happened. He was just another of the thousands missing in the chaos. So without a body, but based on his last recorded combat position, the German army issued the fatal document, Wilhelm Adler, killed in action. The report was signed and stamped with the official date, a cold, impersonal piece of paper that ended the life of someone still breathing. The notification was sent to the small village in Austria. When Wilhelm's mother received the envelope, time seemed to stop. She read it again and again, hoping it was a mistake, but the words were clear. Your son fell with honor for the Reich. Mourning began immediately. The church bells rang. A symbolic funeral was held, with a portrait of Wilhelm placed atop an empty coffin. Neighbors brought flowers. His siblings cried in silence. But far away, buried in snow and lost in the world, Wilhelm was still alive. He didn't know that to everyone else, he was already dead. Back in the village where Wilhelm Adler had once lived, the arrival of the official death notice struck the family like a blow to the chest. His mother, holding the paper in her hands, collapsed on the kitchen floor, weeping in a dry, breathless sob as if all the air had left her lungs. His father, a man of few words, simply walked out to the yard and stared at the horizon for hours. Without speaking, Wilhelm's name was printed coldly on the page, followed by the sentence, "Fell bravely in service to the Reich." But there was no body, no exact date, no details, only the heartbreaking news of a permanent absence. Even without a body, the family decided to honor his memory. In the small village church, a symbolic funeral was held. The coffin, empty, was draped with a flag and carried to the cemetery by silent neighbors. On the altar, a photo of Wilhelm smiling in his younger days. His younger sister placed a small piece of wood on the coffin, a carving he had made himself. It was all that was left. In the cold earth, they dug a grave that for everyone sealed the end of Wilhelm's life. Little did they know that, on the other side of the world, the supposed dead man was still fighting to survive. While the village buried an empty coffin, Wilhelm Adler was still breathing, unconscious beneath the frozen rubble of a ruin in Stalingrad. Hours after the explosion, a group of Soviet soldiers, searching the area for supplies and possible prisoners, found his half-dead body. He was covered in dried blood, his leg wounded, and his uniform in tatters. He had no identification. His documents had burned along with his backpack. To the Soviets, he was just another fallen German soldier. But since he still showed signs of life, they dragged him onto a makeshift truck and took him to a prisoner camp, hoping he might offer useful information later. Wilhelm woke up days later in a poorly insulated army tent, snow creeping through the cracks. His wounds had been treated crudely, and his name? No one asked. In that hostile and suspicious world, a prisoner without identity was just another number. He could barely speak, and when he tried, his captors either didn't understand German or pretended not to. The pain was constant, but not greater than the fear. Wilhelm was alone in an unknown place with no name, no face, no country. To everyone else, he had died. But inside him, the will to live still burned like a stubborn flame beneath the ice. Wilhelm Adler went from a lost soldier to a forgotten prisoner, thrown into the frozen heart of Siberia like so many others who never came back. The camp he was sent to was isolated among endless forests, surrounded by watchtowers, barbed wire and snow everywhere. The cold bit into the skin like teeth. His boots were torn, and the Soviet uniforms they received were far too thin for the brutal Siberian winter. In the first month, Wilhelm lost feeling in parts of his fingers. With each passing day, his body weakened, but his mind fought to stay sharp. Meals were minimal, a piece of hard bread in the morning, a bowl of watery soup at night. They worked 10, 12, sometimes 15 hours a day, chopping trees, carrying stones, building railways in the middle of nowhere. Anyone who collapsed was left behind. Many died in their sleep, frozen. The guards spoke little, but their looks and rifle butts made one thing clear. There was no escape. Wilhelm learned to stay quiet, to observe, to endure. For years, he didn't hear his name again, He was just a number, a body to be used. But inside, the memory of his family, his village, and the promise to return kept the spark of survival alive. In Siberia, Wilhelm Adler ceased to be Wilhelm. Without documents, without fellow soldiers to identify him, and without fluency in Russian, he became just another face among thousands. In the prison camp, he was given a number, written in red. Ink on a wooden tag hung around his neck, 457 to Z. No one asked his real name, no one wanted to know. It was easier to control men without identity, without a past, without a future. That number was what they called in the records, in forced labor shifts, in food lines. 457Z, move! 457Z, shut up! It was as if his soul had been slowly erased, replaced by a meaningless code. Wilhelm tried in the first few months to explain who he was, but the guards paid no attention. Some mocked him, others hit him before he could finish a sentence. Over time, he gave up trying to prove his existence. His language faded. Even the memory of his own voice seemed to dissolve into the icy Siberian wind. His dreams grew hazy, and sometimes he wondered if his home had ever really existed. But there was something that not even the cold, the shouting, or the numbers could erase. The quiet hope that one day someone would call him by the name he was born with, Wilhelm. In May 1945, the world celebrated the end of World War II. The streets of Paris, London, and Moscow were filled with cheers, flags, and strangers hugging each other. But in Siberia, the silence remained. For Wilhelm Adler, the war ended without fanfare. He learned of Germany's surrender through whispers among the prisoners, passed from one mouth to another like a forbidden secret. The war is over. The Reich has fallen. For a moment, Wilhelm thought he would finally go home, that the nightmare was nearly over. But he was wrong. The Soviets didn't release all the prisoners. Many were kept as reconstruction workers, a polite term for forced labor. Wilhelm, still without an official identity, was added to that list. He was transferred from a prisoner camp to labor camps scattered across the vast Russian territory. He built roads, cleared ruins, hauled timber. It was as if the war still lived on, in the orders he received, the shouts of foremen, the rationed food, and the freezing nights. From 1945 to 1950, Wilhelm worked like a shadow, invisible to the world, forgotten by his country. 5 years of a freedom that never came, a time that seemed to stand still. But even in that exile without bars, he waited, and he would wait. As long as it took, it was during the harsh winter of 1950 that hope returned, faint but real, in the cutting winds of Siberia. Wilhelm Adler, now with a gaunt body and a face aged far beyond his years, crossed paths with a man who would change his story. Janusz Kowalski, a former Polish prisoner who had gained limited freedom after cooperating with the Soviets. Janusz worked as an interpreter and warehouse assistant, which gave him access to documents, supplies, and transport routes. Over time, he noticed Wilhelm's silent, persistent gaze, a look that refused to give in to oblivion. In secret, the two began exchanging words, bits of bread, and eventually their plans. Escape seemed impossible. Fences, guards, patrols, and freezing cold. But Janusz had a hidden map, a civilian uniform, and a kind of courage born from loss. After weeks of preparation on a snowy night, the two disappeared into the darkness. They walked through frozen forests, slept under fallen trees, drank from icy rivers, and avoided villages. With every step, death felt closer. But they pressed on. After nearly 20 days, they crossed the Soviet border, exhausted, feet bleeding, but alive. For the first time in almost a decade, Wilhelm was no longer a number. He was free. And his soul, though scarred, could finally breathe again. Wilhelm Adler stepped onto Austrian soil again in the autumn of 1950, nearly 10 years after being declared dead. But the Austria he returned to was not the same. His once lively village now felt frozen in time, ruined homes, shattered windows, and silent streets. Many neighbors had left, and those who remained carried the weight of a war that had taken everything. Dressed in simple clothes, with a thick beard and a worn-out face, Wilhelm barely recognized the place, and the place didn't recognize him either. He wandered through the alleys with a heavy heart until he reached the plot where his house once stood. All that remained were pieces of wall and rotting wood. An old man watched him from a distance, suspicious. When Wilhelm introduced himself, the man laughed with disbelief. "That's impossible. Wilhelm died years ago. We went to the funeral. I carried the coffin myself. No documents, no proof, just his words and a face, now aged and marked by suffering. He searched for family, only to hear the worst. Both parents had died during the war. His father of sorrow, his mother of illness." Wilhelm sat down at the edge of what was once his home and wept. Not because he was lost, but because he no longer had anywhere to belong. Days later, after wandering through the ruined village, Wilhelm learned from an old woman watching from behind a window that his younger sister Greta was still alive. She lived in a small house near the old school. With a pounding heart and unsteady breath, he made his way there. Every step felt heavier than the last. When he arrived, he knocked on the door with trembling hands. A woman opened, now an adult, with dark hair tied back and a face marked by time. She looked him in the eyes, long and silently, but said nothing. Wilhelm smiled, overwhelmed, and said, "Greta, it's me. I'm Wilhelm." She stepped back, her eyes filled with confusion. "No, that can't be true. My brother died in the war," Wilhelm insisted. He spoke of things only the two of them knew. The wooden carving he'd made for her, the dog named Bruno they had as children, the secret hiding spot in the barn. Slowly, Greta's face began to change. Tears welled up without warning. She brought her hand to her mouth and whispered, her voice trembling, "Wilhelm, it's really you." They embraced tightly, as if trying to stitch together the years that had been torn apart. In that moment, Wilhelm stopped being a ghost. He was a brother again. He was human again. Rebuilding a life after so much time felt harder than surviving the war itself. Wilhelm Adler, now nearly 30, had returned to a place that no longer recognized him, not by his face, nor by his story. His village, his neighbors, his family, everything had changed. The world had moved on while he remained frozen in time, trapped behind fences, in snow, and in silence. The first months were the hardest. He had no documents, no money, no profession. In the eyes of the government, he was a missing person, or worse, a stranger. With the help of his sister Greta, Wilhelm began slowly. He worked as a carpenter, using the skills he had learned as a boy from his father. With every bench he repaired, every door he built, he felt like he was also rebuilding himself from the inside. He was no longer the young dreamer who had gone off to war. He was a marked man, but still standing. His story began to spread through the village, first as a rumor, then as confirmed truth. "The man who came back from the dead," they said. Children watched him with curiosity. Adults greeted him with respect. Wilhelm never bragged, but he knew that his journey had become something greater, a living legend. And even with scars that would never fade, he learned to live again, one day at a time, in peace with a soul finally at home. And now that you know the whole truth about Wilhelm Adler, share this video with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to start over. Send it to a friend going through a hard time, to someone who's thought about giving up, or even in the family group chat. Because this story deserves to be told, remembered, and felt. Comment below. Would you believe it if someone came back years later claiming to be your brother? I want to hear your thoughts. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next story might become your favorite or give you chills all over again. If this story touched your heart, take a screenshot now and post it to your stories tagging us. Let's spread this story to the world, because those who were once forgotten will now be remembered.